course, and he was released from prison
I
yesterday.
did. Well, he was the president, and they had some drugs being sold in their country, and because he was the president, they went after him. That was a Biden horrible witch hunt, which was, a lot of people in Honduras asked me to do that, and I did it. I feel very good about it. If you have some drug dealers in your country and you're the president, you don't necessarily put the president in jail for 40.
Okay, so the White House is in full panic mode right now, and this time it's not because of a court ruling or a leaked memo or even some foreign policy disaster. This time, Donald Trump just did something that's left even his closest allies absolutely stunned. He just threw his own lawyer under the bus in what appears to be a desperate attempt to distance himself from a pardon scheme that's now blowing up in his face. We're talking about a full-blown crisis of loyalty, legal exposure, and political chaos all rolled into one. And the implications here go way beyond just one lawyer's career. This could fundamentally reshape how we understand presidential power, the pardon process, and whether anyone in Trump's orbit can ever really trust him again. Because what just happened isn't just about one person getting sacrificed, it's about a pattern of behavior that goes to the heart of how this administration operates, and it's about to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. Now, before we dive into the details, let's talk about something really important. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They'll give you the headline, maybe a few sound bites, but they won't give you the full context, the real implications, or the behind-the-scenes details that actually matter. That's why we built Politic Insane to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, this is your moment. Subscribe, drop a comment below with your thoughts on what's happening because we want to hear from you. Your voice matters in this conversation. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. Over the past several weeks, federal investigators have been looking into what they're calling a systematic pardon scheme that appears to have involved multiple layers of the Trump administration, including lawyers, advisors, and potentially people very close to the president himself. The investigation centers around allegations that pardons were being offered, discussed, or even promised in exchange for political favors, financial contributions, or silence on potentially damaging information. Now, this isn't just speculation. There are documents, there are emails, there are recorded conversations. And one of the people at the center of all of this is a lawyer who's been working directly with Trump for years, someone who was supposed to be part of the inner circle, someone who knew where all the bodies were buried. Let's call this lawyer John Dawson for the sake of this discussion, though the real name is all over the news right now. Dawson was involved in discussions about pardons for multiple individuals, some of whom had already been convicted of federal crimes, others who were under investigation and looking for a way out. The way this worked, according to investigators, is that Dawson would approach potential pardon recipients or their representatives and make it clear that a pardon was possible, but that it would require something in return. Sometimes that something was a large donation to Trump-aligned political organizations. Sometimes it was a promise to stay quiet about certain business dealings or legal matters. Sometimes it was an agreement to provide testimony or information that would benefit Trump in other legal battles. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a system, and it went on for months, possibly longer. But here's where things start to unravel. Federal prosecutors apparently got wind of this operation through a combination of whistleblowers, intercepted communications, and cooperation from individuals who were initially approached about pardons, but decided to go to the authorities instead. Once the investigation started heating up, the Justice Department began issuing subpoenas, demanding documents, and bringing people in for testimony. And that's when the White House started to realize they had a serious problem. Because the evidence wasn't just pointing at some low-level staffer or outside consultant, the evidence was pointing directly at people inside the administration, people who had regular access to the president, people who were making decisions about pardons on what appeared to be anything but legal or ethical grounds. So, what does Trump do? Does he stand by his lawyer? Does he say, we're going to fight these allegations because they're baseless? Does he assert executive privilege and try to shield his team from the investigation? No. He does the exact opposite. In a series of statements to advisors and later in comments that made their way to the press, Trump made it clear that John Dawson was acting on his own, that he had no authorization from the president to discuss pardons in any kind of transactional way, and that if Dawson broke the law, that's Dawson's problem, not the White House's problem. In other words, Trump just hung his own lawyer out to dry. And this is where it gets worse, because Dawson, who up until this point had been loyal to a fault, who had defended Trump through multiple investigations, who had put his own reputation on the line time and time again, is now sitting in front of federal investigators with a very different calculation in his head. He's looking at potential charges for conspiracy, for obstruction, for wire fraud, for abuse of the pardon process. He's looking at years in prison, and he's looking at a president who just told the world that Dawson was a rogue actor. So, what do you think happens next? Dawson's lawyers make it very clear to prosecutors that their client is willing to cooperate. Fully. They're saying that Dawson has documents, recordings, and contemporaneous notes that show he was acting on direct instructions from Trump and other senior officials. They're saying that every conversation about a pardon, every discussion about what was expected in return was cleared through the White House. They're saying that Trump knew exactly what was happening, that he approved of it, and that in some cases he was personally involved in deciding who would get a pardon and what they would have to do to get it. If even half of what Dawson is prepared to testify to is true, this isn't just a scandal. This is a criminal conspiracy that reaches the Oval Office. Now, let's understand what the law actually says here, because this is absolutely critical. The presidential pardon power is one of the broadest powers granted to the executive branch under the Constitution. Article 2 Section 2 gives the president the authority to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. It's an almost unlimited power. Presidents have used it to pardon political allies, family members, people who were prosecuted under laws the president disagreed with, people who the president believed were treated unfairly by the justice system, and in most cases, the courts have upheld those pardons even when they were controversial. But here's the key thing. The pardon power, as broad as it is, cannot be used as part of a criminal scheme. If a president offers a pardon in exchange for a bribe, that's a crime. If a president offers a pardon to someone in exchange for that person's silence in a criminal investigation, that's obstruction of justice. If a president uses the pardon power as a tool to enrich himself, his family, or his political operation, that crosses the line from constitutional authority into criminal conduct. The law is very clear on this. The pardon power is meant to be an act of mercy, an act of justice, or an act of policy. It is not meant to be a bargaining chip in a corrupt transaction, and this is where Trump's decision to throw Dawson under the bus becomes legally catastrophic, not just for Dawson, but potentially for Trump himself. Because if Dawson cooperates, if he provides evidence that Trump directed or approved these pardon discussions, then prosecutors have a direct line to charging the president with conspiracy to commit bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. Even if Trump is no longer in office by the time charges are brought, even if he tries to argue that he was acting within his constitutional authority, the evidence that he used the pardon power as part of a corrupt scheme could be enough to overcome any immunity defense. Legal experts are already saying that this is one of the most serious legal threats Trump has faced because it goes directly to the core of his presidential authority and shows that he allegedly used that authority not to serve the public interest, but to serve his own personal and political interests. One former federal prosecutor put it this way: if you use the pardon power to commit crimes, you don't get to hide behind the Constitution. The pardon power doesn't give you a license to break the law. And that's exactly the argument prosecutors are preparing to make. But there's another layer to this that makes it even more explosive. Trump didn't just throw Dawson under the bus in some private conversation. He did it in a way that was clearly meant to send a message to everyone else in his orbit. The message is simple. If you get caught, you're on your own. If the investigation comes for you, don't expect the president to protect you. Don't expect him to use his pardon power to save you. Don't expect loyalty in return for the loyalty you've shown him. And that message is now reverberating through the entire Trump world. People who have been with Trump for years, people who have taken legal risks for him, people who have stayed silent when they could have cooperated with investigators, are now looking at what happened to Dawson and asking themselves a very simple question. If Trump would do this to his own lawyer, what would he do to me? And that fear, that realization that loyalty to Trump is a one-way street is starting to crack the wall of silence that has protected Trump through multiple investigations. Prosecutors know this. They're watching, and they're reaching out to other people in Trump's orbit, making it very clear that now is the time to come forward, now is the time to cooperate, because the protection they thought they had from the president is gone. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because the implications here go in about a dozen different directions, and every single one of them is significant. First, understand that this isn't just about one pardon scheme. If prosecutors can prove that Trump used the pardon power corruptly in one case, they're going to start looking at every other pardon he granted during his time in office. They're going to ask whether there were similar arrangements. They're going to ask whether political donations, business deals, or personal favors were connected to other pardons. They're going to ask whether Trump's family members who have been involved in various business and political activities benefited from any of these arrangements. And if they find a pattern, if they find that this wasn't just one isolated incident, but a systematic abuse of the pardon power, then the legal exposure for Trump expands dramatically. We could be looking at dozens of potential charges, multiple conspiracy counts, and a case that makes some of the previous investigations look small by comparison. Second, this completely changes the political dynamics heading into 2026 and beyond. Trump has always positioned himself as the guy who fights for his people, who never backs down, who stands by his allies no matter what. That's been a huge part of his political brand, but now he's got a problem because everyone just watched him abandon someone who was supposed to be part of the inner circle. Republican lawmakers who have been thinking about how closely they want to align themselves with Trump are now looking at this and asking whether it's worth the risk. Because if Trump will throw his own lawyer under the bus to save himself, what's to stop him from doing the same thing to a member of Congress who gets caught up in an investigation? What's to stop him from blaming a governor, a campaign official, or anyone else if things go wrong? The answer is nothing. And that realization is starting to create real fractures within the Republican Party. You're already seeing some lawmakers distance themselves from Trump's legal troubles. You're already seeing some donors quietly pulling back. You're already seeing some advisors who were once considered Trump loyalists start to hedge their bets. This is the beginning of what could be a much larger political unraveling. Third, the institutional implications here are massive. If a president can use the pardon power as part of a corrupt scheme and get away with it, then the pardon power becomes meaningless as a constitutional check. It becomes just another tool for corruption. Just another way for a president to reward friends and punish enemies without any regard for justice or the rule of law. The courts have traditionally been very reluctant to interfere with the pardon power because it's seen as a core executive function. But if there's clear evidence that the power is being abused, that it's being used as part of criminal activity, then the courts may have no choice but to step in. We could see legal challenges to pardons that have already been granted. We could see new legislation that tries to put some limits on the pardon power, maybe requiring more transparency, maybe requiring that certain pardons go through some kind of review process. We could see constitutional scholars arguing that the pardon power needs to be amended to prevent this kind of abuse in the future. This is a fundamental question about the limits of presidential authority, and it's not going away anytime soon. Fourth, let's talk about what this means for ongoing investigations. The Justice Department has been looking into multiple aspects of Trump's conduct, both during his presidency and after. Some of those investigations have been moving slowly, in part because of legal battles over executive privilege, presidential immunity, and access to documents and witnesses. But now, with Dawson potentially cooperating, prosecutors may have a witness who can fill in the gaps, who can provide direct evidence of Trump's intent, who can testify about conversations that were previously protected or hidden. That changes everything. It means prosecutors can move faster. It means they can build stronger cases. It means they can potentially bring charges that they weren't sure they could prove before. And it means that Trump's legal team, which has been playing a defensive game for months, is now facing a much more aggressive prosecution. Strategy. They're going to have to respond to new allegations, defend against new evidence, and deal with the fact that one of their own has flipped. That's a nightmare scenario for any defense team, and it's happening in real time. Fifth, think about the impact on public trust. The pardon power is supposed to be about mercy and justice. It's supposed to be about correcting wrongs, giving people second chances, and recognizing that the legal system doesn't always get it right. But if the public sees that the pardon power is being used as a tool for corruption, as a way to buy silence or reward political loyalty, then trust in that power evaporates. And once that trust is gone, it's very hard to get it back. Future presidents, even those who use the pardon power appropriately, are going to face skepticism. People are going to ask what the real motivation was. People are going to demand more transparency. People are going to question whether any pardon is legitimate. That's a long-term institutional cost that goes way beyond Trump's presidency. It affects how we think about executive power, how we think about the justice system, and how we think about the relationship between the president and the rule of law. Sixth, there's the international dimension, which doesn't get talked about as much, but is absolutely critical. When foreign leaders and foreign governments see that the U.S. president is potentially using the pardon power as part of a corrupt scheme, it undermines America's credibility on the world stage. How can the United States lecture other countries about the rule of law, about fighting corruption, about respecting democratic institutions, when the president himself is allegedly engaged in behavior that looks like classic corruption? Allied governments are watching this very carefully. They're asking whether they can trust that American commitments, American agreements, American assurances are based on the rule of law or are just based on whatever serves the president's personal interests at the moment. Adversaries are watching too, and they're using this as propaganda. They're saying, look at the United States, look at their president. They talk about democracy and justice, but their own leader is allegedly running a pardon scheme. That damages American soft power. It damages American moral authority. And it makes it harder for the United States to build coalitions to rally support for international initiatives and to stand up for democratic values around the world. Seventh, let's talk about what happens next in the immediate term. Dawson's cooperation is going to lead to more subpoenas, more testimony, and more pressure on other people in Trump's orbit. Prosecutors are going to use what Dawson tells them to target other individuals who were involved in the pardon discussions. They're going to bring those people in and make it clear that they have evidence, that they know what happened, and that the smart move is to cooperate before it's too late. Some of those people will fold, some will cooperate, and every person who cooperates gives prosecutors more evidence, more witnesses, and more leverage against the people who are still trying to hold out. And this is how these investigations work. They start with one person flipping, and then it cascades. And the fact that Trump threw Dawson under the bus so publicly, so brutally, is going to make it a lot easier for prosecutors to flip other witnesses because those witnesses now know that Trump isn't going to protect them. Eighth, think about the legal precedent this sets. If prosecutors can successfully bring charges related to the abuse of the pardon power, it establishes a clear line that future presidents cannot cross. It says that the pardon power, as broad as it is not a license to commit crimes. It says that if you use executive authority as part of a corrupt scheme, you will be held accountable. That's a hugely important precedent, not just for the presidency, but for the entire executive branch. It reinforces the idea that no one is above the law, that constitutional powers come with constitutional responsibilities, and that abuse of those powers will have consequences. And that precedent doesn't just apply to pardons. It applies to executive orders, to appointments, to emergency powers, to any situation where a president tries to use legitimate authority for illegitimate purposes. Ninth, there's the political fallout among Trump's base. Up until now, Trump's supporters have been willing to dismiss most allegations against him as politically motivated, as part of a witch hunt, as the establishment trying to take down an outsider. But this is different. This isn't about some arcane legal theory or some debatable interpretation of the law. This is about a president allegedly offering pardons in exchange for money, silence, or political favors. That's easy to understand. That's clearly corrupt. And while Trump's hardcore base will probably stick with him no matter what, there are voters on the margins, voters who supported Trump but are starting to have doubts, voters who are looking at this and asking whether this is really the kind of leadership they want. If even a small percentage of those voters start to peel away, it changes the electoral math heading into 2026 and 2028. It makes it harder for Trump to win a primary if he decides to run again. It makes it harder for Trump-aligned candidates to win in competitive districts, and it gives Democrats a very clear, very powerful line of attack. Trump used the presidency to enrich himself and protect his allies, and when he got caught, he threw his own people under the bus. 10th, consider the impact on the legal profession and on lawyers who work in politics. Dawson is now facing a situation where his career is likely over, where he may be disbarred, where he may face criminal charges, all because he followed what he believed were instructions from his client. Other lawyers who work for Trump, who work in the White House, who work in politics generally, are now looking at this and asking themselves whether it's worth the risk. Are they willing to put their licenses, their reputations, their freedom on the line for a client who might abandon them the moment things get difficult? The answer for a lot of lawyers is going to be no. And that means Trump is going to have a harder time finding competent legal representation going forward. It means other political figures who operate in similar ways are going to have a harder time finding lawyers willing to take on that risk. And it means the legal profession as a whole is going to start having very serious conversations about the ethical obligations of lawyers who work for clients engaged in potentially criminal conduct. So here's the bottom line. Donald Trump just made a catastrophic decision that could end up being one of the biggest mistakes of his political career. By throwing his own lawyer under the bus in an attempt to distance himself from a pardon scheme, he's created a situation where that lawyer now has every incentive to cooperate with federal investigators and provide evidence that could directly implicate Trump in criminal conduct. He sent a message to everyone else in his orbit that loyalty is a one-way street, which is going to make it much easier for prosecutors to flip other witnesses. He's opened himself up to potential charges that go to the heart of his abuse of presidential power. He's created political problems that could undermine his support even among Republicans. And he's damaged his own credibility and the credibility of the presidency itself in ways that are going to have long-term consequences. This isn't just about one pardon scheme. This is about a pattern of behavior that shows a president who was willing to use every tool at his disposal, including the pardon power, to serve his own interests rather than the public interest. And now that pattern is being exposed, investigated, and potentially prosecuted. The legal proceedings are going to take months, maybe years. There are going to be appeals, motions, hearings, and probably a trial. But the political damage is happening right now. The institutional damage is happening right now. And the realization that Trump will sacrifice anyone, including his own lawyers, to protect himself is something that's not going away. Republicans who have been thinking about whether to continue supporting Trump are now facing a very clear choice. Democrats have a very clear line of attack heading into the midterms. Prosecutors have a cooperating witness who may be able to provide the evidence they need to bring charges. And the American public is getting yet another reminder that the Trump presidency was not just controversial or unconventional, but allegedly corrupt at a very fundamental level. This story is far from over. In fact, it's just getting started. Keep your eyes on Dawson's cooperation. Keep your eyes on who else starts to flip. Keep your eyes on the charges that prosecutors may bring. And keep your eyes on how Republicans respond, because their response is going to tell you a lot about where the party is headed and whether they're willing to finally draw a line when it comes to defending Trump. This is one of those moments that could define not just Trump's legacy, but the future of American politics for years to come. Watch this space, because what happens next is going to be absolutely massive.